Hello everyone and welcome back. In the previous lecture we saw how to create a class and then how to initialize our attributes using the special init method, and then we saw that Python calls the special init method when we create a new instance of our class. In this example we created an instance of this person class, and we were able to obtain information like name, last name, and telephone number. Let me copy this class and then see another example. Okay, I'll paste it here. So in this person's class, the init method, it takes 4 attributes: self, name, last name, and telephone. Another thing we can do is we can assign default value to any of these attributes. For instance, let's assign a default telephone number. So we'll set the telephone number to be equal to, let's say, 445 342 1245. Okay, now let's create an instance of the person's class, this person class. So we simply say person, and then we say that this person class takes 4 attributes. So the first one is self, we don't need to pass that. Then we need name, let's say Jane, last name, let's say Smith, and telephone number, let's pass 345 569 9803. Then let's save this in a variable called y. Now if we call y, we see that it's of the class person instance. And if we want to find out the available methods that we have for this object y, we simply say y and then that, hit tab on your keyboard, and you'll see the available methods that we have for y. And if we choose name, for instance, y.name, and run it, we get Jane. Then if we do y.last name, we get Smith. Okay. Next, let's create another instance of this person class. So we say person, and then we'll pass our attributes. Let's say Corey, and then for last name I'll pass Paul. Okay, and then save this in another variable called a. So here we know that it takes 4 attributes. Our person class takes 4 attributes, but we only provided 3 in here: self, Corey, and Paul. What do you think will happen if I run this? Will I get an error? So in this case, I will not get an error. Even if our special method takes our person's class takes 4 attributes and we only provided 3, but there is a default value for our telephone attribute. That means if we don't pass an attribute for our telephone, Python will assign and use this default value for telephone. So if we run this, we'll not get an error. And then if I call, let's say a.name, we'll get Corey. And if we call the telephone attribute, we'll get this default telephone number. Okay, that's very important. if we have a default value for any of our attributes, we don't necessarily need to include them when we create an instance of the class. So that's not required, and if you don't pass that attribute, the default value will be assigned to your instance of the class object. So that's what happened here. And another thing we can do is, so here on our person class, we see that name is Corey, and if we want to assign a different name, we can do the following. So a.name, and then we can set it to be equal to, let's say, another name. Let's say John. Now we are setting the name to be John. A.name is equal to John. Now if we call the name, we'll get John. So Corey is no longer the name. Now it's John. We can do that also. Let me copy this and then show you another example. So in this case, I'll assign a default value to my name attribute also. Let's say Harry. Okay, in this case, and then I'll pass person. Let's just pass Corey. So in this case, the default values for name and telephone will be used. So we only need to pass last name here, right? And so this is correct, but there is one problem with this. So if we run this, we'll get an error. Let me run it and then show you what the error is. So it says non-default argument follows default argument. So the problem is with this attribute. So whenever we assign attributes, default values to our attributes, that attribute has to be at the end of the init method. Okay, that's what this error is saying. So if you have default attributes, they should be defined at the end. Those default attributes should be toward the end, and no non-default argument should follow your default arguments. That's what this error is saying. So basically, we have to have last name here and then delete it here. I just wanted to show you that. So now we have self, last name, which is a non-default argument. Then we have our two default arguments, name and telephone number. Let's run it now. Okay, if we call A now, we see that it's of a person instance. And then if you hit tab, you'll see the different methods available for our object A. If you select telephone number, for instance, you'll get this default value. And we mentioned that if you don't want to use the default values, you can pass different attributes when you create an instance of that person class. Let's create another instance and save it in a variable called B. So B is equal to person, and we can pass. So let's pass last name. We can pass Paul. For first name, we can pass, let's say, Tim. And then for telephone number, we can pass some different phone number. Okay. Now if we call B dot hit tab, and then if you choose last name, you get Paul. Then B dot first name is with that name we get team. So that's how you can play around and then assign attributes to your class. Next, let me show you one other example. I'll create another attribute known as address. Then let's say that to be equal to, let's say, New York. Notice I am putting this attribute right after our class definition and outside of our first method. So this attribute is called a class attribute. This is also known as class variables, or more like global variables. And this class variables can be used by any of your methods in our class. Okay, these are called class variables, and all the class variables are put right next to your class definition and outside of your first method, your first special method. Notice here it's at the same level as your methods, and if you have any additional method, it will be at the same level. So those are class variables, and they are accessible by all the methods in your class. Okay, let's see an example. So in this case, we'll create another instance of this person's class. And save it in a variable called C. Then we'll set it to be equal to person, and then let's pass last name. Let's say Newman, and then use the default values for name and telephone. Now, if you say C dot and then hit tab, notice that you have an additional method available for you now, the address method, right? C dot tab, now we have address. That's what I meant by this class variables being accessible or available to all your methods in your class. Okay, and then if you choose that, see that address, and then run it, you'll get New York. Now we have New York. And then if you want, you can set it to a different address. Let's say New Jersey. Now if we call see that address, we see that New Jersey is the new address. Just wanted to show you that this is a class variable, and this is an example of a class variable, and we can have more than one class variable. Okay, let's say city is equal to New York City. We can have that also, and then once we create a new instance, we see that those class variables will be available for us. Now we have address and city in addition to these three attributes. Okay, great. This is what I have for this lecture, and in the next lecture we'll continue our discussion on classes. Thank you everyone.